Let me ask you something. Have you ever checked your glucose 1 hour after eating and thought, how is that number that high? I barely ate anything. Has that happened to you? Or maybe you ate a small dinner, you woke up the next morning, you check your fasting glucose, and somehow it's higher than it was the night before, even though you did everything right. You didn't binge, you didn't eat dessert, you didn't have a cheat meal, you didn't fall off track, and somewhere in the back of your mind, there's this quiet fear. Is this just getting worse no matter what I do? If that's where you are right now, I want you to take a breath, because what I'm about to show you is one of the simplest, fastest, and most underused tools in all of blood sugar physiology. No supplements, no carb restriction, no weird food tricks, no starvation, no extreme workouts, just 15 minutes of activating a mechanism known as contraction-mediated glucose uptake. 15 minutes that can transform your health. But before we start, if you want our free guide that shows you exactly how to restore insulin sensitivity with food, movement, and daily habits, comment guide below and we'll send it to you. Okay, let's dive into it, because I'm going to show you exactly why this mechanism works physiologically, what the science shows in people with diabetes and in people without diabetes, and why this tiny habit can dramatically accelerate the reversal of insulin resistance. Because this is not about chasing numbers. This is about restoring normal physiology. And that's exactly what we focus on here at Mastering Diabetes. So let's break this down. Let's start at the very beginning of a blood sugar spike. What actually happens right after you eat? Every time you eat carbohydrates, they get broken down into glucose. That glucose enters your bloodstream. Then your pancreas releases insulin. Think of insulin like a key, and think of your muscle and liver cells like locks. When the lock is clean, the key turns easily. Glucose enters the cell. Blood sugar comes back down. That's what normal physiology looks like. But when fat builds up inside your muscle and liver cells, what researchers call intramyocellular lipid and hepatic lipid accumulation, insulin signaling starts to fail. And this is the part almost nobody explains well. It's not that your body suddenly can't handle carbs. It's that fat has built up inside the very tissues that are supposed to respond to insulin. Now, imagine trying to turn a key in a lock that's been packed with gum. The key still exists, the lock still exists, but it doesn't churn smoothly anymore. That is insulin resistance. And once that happens, glucose lingers in the bloodstream longer than it should. That's when you start seeing higher post-meal spikes, higher fasting glucose, more insulin being released, more fat being stored, and metabolism that feels like it's constantly fighting you. Now, here's the part that changes everything. Your muscle tissue does not rely on insulin to take in glucose. It has another pathway, one that gets activated when your muscles contract, hence the name contraction-mediated glucose uptake. And walking for just 15 minutes turns it on. This is what makes post-meal walking so powerful. When your muscles contract, they can pull glucose out of the bloodstream without relying entirely on insulin. That means even if insulin signaling is impaired, even if the lock is sticky, even if your body is already insulin resistant, your muscles can still open a side door and let glucose in. That's why walking after a meal can lower your blood sugar almost immediately. You're not waiting for your pancreas to work harder. You're not waiting for insulin to become magically more effective. You're activating the biggest glucose sink in your body, your skeletal muscle, right when blood sugar is rising. And because timing matters so much here, let's go to the first study. In 2013, researchers published a randomized crossover trial in diabetes care looking at older adults with type 2 diabetes. Participants completed 2 different exercise conditions. In one condition, they performed one continuous 45-minute walk in the morning. In the other condition, they did 3 separate 15-minute walks immediately after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So let's stop there for a second. This was not more exercise. It was not more calories burned. It was not a harder workout. It was the same total amount of walking. The only thing that changed was when they did it. And the result? The 3 short post-meal walks reduced 3-hour postprandial glucose significantly more than the single longer morning walk. And the biggest improvement happened after dinner, when insulin sensitivity is naturally lowest. That matters so much because most people think exercise only counts if it's long, hard, sweaty, or done in a dedicated workout session. But this study proves something far more useful. Timing can matter more than duration. When you walk right after eating, you intercept glucose before it has time to pile up in the bloodstream. It's like opening extra drains while the sink is filling. And if your blood sugar tends to stay elevated for hours after meals, this is one of the fastest ways to change that pattern. Now, let's go one level deeper, because once you understand the mechanism, this habit becomes much more motivating. When you walk, your muscles contract over and over again. That contraction activates signaling molecules like AMPK and stimulates GLUT4 translocation to the cell surface. GLUT4 is essentially a glucose transporter, a doorway that allows glucose to move from the bloodstream into the muscle cell. And here's the part that feels almost like cheating. This pathway is insulin independent. That means even if insulin signaling is impaired because of fat inside the cell, muscle contraction can still pull glucose in. So walking after a meal is not just burning off calories, it is activating an entirely different glucose disposal pathway. That's why I like this analogy. If insulin is the front door, walking opens a side door. And because skeletal muscle is the largest glucose sink in your body, that side door can make a huge difference very quickly. This is not a subtle effect. This is one of the most powerful backup systems your body has. And this doesn't only help people with diabetes. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, sure, that makes sense for someone with type 2 diabetes, but what if I'm only pre-diabetic, or I'm just trying to avoid getting there? Great question, because this effect shows up across the entire spectrum of insulin sensitivity. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport looked at sedentary adults without diabetes. Researchers had participants interrupt prolonged sitting every 20 minutes with light walking. Even in these metabolically healthy individuals, glucose and insulin responses improved significantly. That tells us something profound. Insulin resistance is not binary. It's not you have it or you don't. It's a spectrum, and movement improves glucose regulation all along the spectrum. That means this is not just a diabetes trick. This is human physiology. It works in people who've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, it works in people with impaired glucose tolerance, and it works in people who look healthy on paper but are drifting toward insulin resistance. That's why this habit is so powerful. It doesn't just manage dysfunction, it helps prevent dysfunction from getting worse. A 2016 study published in Diabetologia looked at older adults with impaired glucose tolerance. Participants performed just 10 minutes of light walking after each meal. That's it. No sprinting, no intervals, no gym session, no athletic intensity. And what happened? Post-meal glucose spikes reduced by about 12%. That's significant, especially when you realize how low the effort was. This tells us something important. You do not need extreme exercise to improve insulin sensitivity. You need physiologically strategic movement. That's a totally different mindset, because now the question is no longer how hard do I need to work? It becomes, when can I activate muscle while glucose is rising? That question changes everything. Now, here's the part most people miss, and this is one of the biggest reasons this habit can improve fasting glucose too. Insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm. Most people are more insulin sensitive earlier in the day and more insulin resistant later in the evening. So when you eat dinner and then sit still, glucose clearance is naturally slower. That doesn't mean dinner is bad. It means the timing of inactivity matters. Now imagine doing a 15-minute walk right after dinner. You are actively compensating for that natural evening dip in insulin sensitivity. And this is exactly what the study I mentioned previously showed. The greatest glucose reduction occurred after the evening meal. That matters because what happens after dinner influences what happens overnight. And what happens overnight often determines what you wake up to in the morning. So if your fasting glucose feels confusing or stubborn, one of the most important questions you can ask is, what am I doing after dinner? Because a short evening walk can meaningfully reduce overnight hyperglycemia and improve your morning numbers. A lot of people think elevated fasting glucose means I ate the wrong thing. Sometimes that's true, but often what fasting glucose is really reflecting is hepatic insulin resistance. When liver cells are packed with fat, they release glucose overnight when they shouldn't. That's what drives the dawn phenomenon. That's what drives stubborn morning highs. Now, here's where walking helps again. Every time you reduce post-meal glucose exposure, you reduce the total insulin demand on the system. Lower insulin demand means less pressure on the pancreas. Less pressure means it becomes easier for the body to mobilize stored fat from liver and muscle over time. And as intramyocellular and hepatic fat decrease, insulin signaling improves. The lock gets cleaner. The key starts turning more easily. Glucose stops lingering. That's root cause reversal, not just a lower number after dinner, not just good control, actual restoration of physiology. What about high intensity interval training? Wouldn't that be better? Now, you might be wondering, okay, but wouldn't something more intense like HIIT training be even better? And the answer is depends on the goal. For long-term insulin sensitivity, high-intensity interval training can absolutely be powerful. But for immediate post-meal glucose control, walking often wins. Why? Because intense exercise raises stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And in people with significant insulin resistance, those hormones can temporarily raise blood glucose during the workout. That doesn't mean high-intensity interval training is harmful. It just means it's a different tool. If your goal is, I want this post-meal glucose spike to come down now, without adding more hormonal stress, walking is usually the better choice. It lowers glucose quietly, predictably, and without making the nervous system louder. Think of it like this. Walking quietly drains the bathtub. High-intensity interval training can sometimes slosh the water around before it starts draining. Both have their place, but if your number is high right now, walking is usually the most direct answer. And now, let me show you something that makes this whole conversation even more exciting. In 2022, researchers published a fascinating study in iScience looking at activation of the soleus muscle, a deep calf muscle designed for endurance. They found that sustained low-level contraction of the soleus significantly increased glucose oxidation and reduced postprandial glucose levels. That means even small, low-intensity muscle contractions can change blood sugar meaningfully. Why is this so important? Because it proves you don't necessarily need a workout, you need muscle activation. That's a huge psychological shift because suddenly the barrier gets much lower. You don't need perfect weather, gym clothes, an hour of free time, or peak motivation. You just need to activate tissue. So yes, walking is powerful, but so are marching in place, heel raises, stair climbing, light movement around the house, or any kind of post-meal muscle use. The common thread is simple. Muscle contraction during the glucose rise window. That's the secret. Let's connect this back to the Mastering Diabetes philosophy. The real problem is fat inside muscle and liver cells. Carbohydrates are not the cause. They reveal the problem. Walking improves insulin-independent glucose uptake right away. And over time, by reducing total glucose exposure and total insulin demand, it helps create the conditions where fat can begin clearing out. And over time, by reducing total glucose exposure and total insulin demand, it helps create the conditions where fat can begin clearing out of those cells. As fat leaves the cell, insulin signaling improves. Now, the lock is cleaner, the key works better, and carbohydrates become easier to tolerate. That's the goal, not restriction, restoration. We are not trying to fear carbs for life. We are trying to restore the physiology that allows your body to use them the way it was designed to. Again, if you want a full guide with recipes included that help you restore insulin sensitivity, comment guide below and we'll send it your way. It's free. So here's exactly how you're going to start what I taught you today. After breakfast, walk for 10 to 15 minutes. After lunch, do the same if you can. After dinner, make it a priority. That one is especially powerful for overnight glucose and fasting numbers. And if walking is impossible, march in place. Do heel raises, climb stairs, walk around your house, activate your calves. The key principle is this: contract muscle during the glucose rise window. That's what changes the outcome. Now let me zoom out for a moment. Walking after meals is not a standalone cure. It's a lever, but it's an incredibly powerful lever. And when you combine it with low-fat, plant-based, whole food eating, high fiber intake, reduced saturated fat, adequate hydration, better sleep, lower stress, you create a metabolic environment where insulin sensitivity steadily improves. Walking helps drain glucose immediately. Nutrition removes the fat clogging the lock. Together, they restore carbohydrate tolerance. And that's when people start saying, I can eat fruit again. My fasting glucose is normal. I reduced my medication. My numbers finally make sense. Those case studies are real. Go read them at Mastering masteringdiabetes.org. What I love about this strategy is that you do not need to overhaul your whole life tomorrow. You can start tonight. Eat dinner, wait 5 to 10 minutes, walk for 15 minutes, then watch what happens to your glucose curve. You'll likely see a lower peak, a faster return to baseline, and maybe for the first time in a while, proof that your body still responds. And when that happens, something powerful shifts psychologically. You realize my body responds. My physiology isn't broken. It just needs the right inputs. And that is one of the most healing realizations a person with insulin resistance can have. If this makes sense to you and you want a structured plan that combines nutrition, movement, and science-backed strategy to reverse insulin resistance, comment guide below. We'll send you our free guide that walks you step by step through restoring insulin sensitivity the right way. Because your body is not the problem. Insulin resistance is the problem. And walking 15 minutes after meals is one of the simplest, most powerful tools you can start using today. Until next time, keep those carbs high and that A1C low.